thank you to the Living Cities Forum for the invitation to be here with you today. Today, I'll be speaking about default settings of buildings, of physical systems, and of digital systems, and how we can begin to design beyond the defaults. First, I want to thank the Wampanoag Nation and the Massachusetts peoples, on whose lands I am a guest, and on whose lands I completed much of the work that I am speaking about today. I want to start my talk with a personal story, the beginning of a baby. The year was 2013. I was finishing my graduate degree at the MIT Media Lab, and I had also just birthed my beautiful space baby who is depicted here. So this is where I was going to school, the MIT Media Lab. For those who aren't familiar with it, in this building, there are something like 30 different research groups whose activities range from making smart prosthetics to 3D printed houses to robot operas. We often say that our work is looking 20 or 30 years into the future of what the relationship between humans and technology will be. This ambitious mission is embodied by the architecture of the building. It's designed by Pritzker Prize-winning architect Fumihiko Maki. So here's what MIT says about the building. Inside the new structure's airy glass and metal framework, 9 flexible laboratories are organized around a soaring central atrium. Clustering rows of offices around the labs encourage creative interaction, and transparent partitions offer extended sight lines through the building in every direction, allowing multiple activities to be seen from any vantage point. So the architecture of the lab is meant to be inspirational for crafting futures. But there was a problem. I wonder how many of the people watching this video know what this object is. So maybe you know because you used one, or maybe someone you love has used one, or maybe this object is foreign for you. For those of you who may not know, this is a breast pump. This is kind of an old breast pump now, but it's what I was using to feed my baby 10 years ago. And a breast pump, for those who don't know, is a technology that helps mothers and other lactating parents extract breast milk. Breastfeeding is a supply and demand relationship. So if a person goes to work all day and doesn't feed their baby, that acts as a signal to their body to stop producing so much milk. Breast pumps are essential for maintaining the breastfeeding relationship when parent and baby are separated. They also suck, both literally and figuratively. So here's the question. In a beautiful building made of transparent glass with sightlines everywhere, where does a breastfeeding mom pump? The bathroom floor. This is where I found myself in the spring of 2014. I was a student pumping breast milk for my baby daughter on the bathroom floor between research meetings and network science classes. One of the milk bottles had spilled, and I was angry. First at the lost milk, then at the stiff tubes that knocked it over, then at the bathroom floor, and then at the building, and then at the world. Why was I using a crappy, loud machine to pump milk on the bathroom floor at one of the most elite, well-resourced engineering institutions in the whole world? Why do the futures that my institution is inventing not include any babies or breastfeeding parents? And there's a larger question here. When we say that we are inventing the future, why are we mainly centering men's futures? And really, elite men's futures at that, which is an even smaller group. And really, we are centering elite, white, cisgender, heterosexual, non-disabled, Christian, settler colonial men. That is so narrow that less than 1% of the population gets around 90% of the futures designed just for them. It's kind of like a form of future hoarding. So why does this narrow slice of the population get to stand in for the default body or the default user? It's actually very, very strange once you start to think about it. And then once you start seeing how our products and systems are designed for this default body, it actually shows up everywhere. Hub and spoke transportation systems in the US have largely been designed to ignore the needs of women, caregivers, and disabled people. Soap dispensers fail to see darker skin and thus don't dispense soap to darker skinned people. Major companies like Apple release health apps that are oblivious to the fact that more than half of the population menstruates. And it's not only narrow, but it's actually harmful that we allow a tiny subset of the population to stand in for this default universal body. Privileging the elite, white, cisgender, male, non-disabled body in design, in media, in data, and in digital systems has led to inconvenience, harm, and even loss of life. One of the most widely cited cases is that of crash test dummies. Women have a 47% higher chance of injury than men because the car safety industry simply didn't think to test their cars on women-sized crash test dummies until recently. And then digital systems, algorithms, and artificial intelligence are no different. In forthcoming work, several colleagues and I did an audit of ChatGPT in regards to housing recommendations. In hundreds of thousands of prompts, we simulated being people with different demographic characteristics, each moving to a new city. And we asked ChatGPT, which neighborhoods should we buy or rent a house in? Our first finding is that ChatGPT engages in racial and economic steering practices, meaning that it directs Black people to neighborhoods with majority Black people, as well as to those neighborhoods lower in terms of economic opportunity. It steers white people to neighborhoods with white people, and also to neighborhoods with higher socioeconomic opportunities. And it engages in this racial steering without being prompted. So what this means is that the prompt does not say, please tell me what are the majority white neighborhoods in New York City. ChatGPT just assumes that this is what you want it to return. So in this regard, it is actually similar to the racial steering practices of real estate agents and brokers who make assumptions based on their client's race and appearance and steer them into places with neighborhoods with people like them, racially and economically. These practices contribute to ongoing, pernicious racial segregation in US cities, and they also violate the Fair Housing Act. But our second finding from this study relates to these questions of defaults. You might say, well, a fix for this is just to remove all the racial information from the prompt. Just don't say anything about race. But the interesting thing that happened when we didn't include racial information is that ChatGPT gave the same answers as it did for when you did specify that your race was white. So it returned the white neighborhoods with the higher socioeconomic characteristics. So the default response when considering no racial information in the prompt is still a racialized answer, and the race of the response is white. We discuss this in the paper as the default whiteness that is baked into many of our artificially intelligent and algorithmic systems. Aruha Benjamin has a term for this. She calls it default discrimination. And these are those inventions that tend to ignore social cleavages and as such reproduce the default settings of race, class, and gender, among other axes of difference. So her prompt to us is, how do we reimagine the default settings, both of technology and of society? How do we not design for that default body that sits atop a pyramid of privilege? What can we do? So I'll tell you first what we did about the default settings for the story of the baby and the breast pump and the building. I came out of that bathroom at the MIT Media Lab, and I joined forces with the folks that you see here to create the Make the Breast Pump Not Suck hackathon. We wanted to stage an event that would hack not just the pump, but also the system that stigmatizes breastfeeding and that pushes women and parents back to work too soon, and that creates buildings for only the default body. We wanted an event that would center the parents that face the most barriers to breastfeeding instead of those that face the least barriers. So here's a picture of the scene. We had teams who created new products for breastfeeding, chest feeding, and pumping. We had teams who hacked family leave policy. We had teams who created educational resources for parents and communities, and we had teams who architected new visions for lactation spaces. We tried to create a joyful and fun and funny space for all the parents and babies and students and policymakers and designers who participated. So for example, we had an art gallery with pump art, and we had a baby village where babies and their parents could get massages or just take naps. We had a zine library about reproductive health and justice, curated by Maria Aaron Jones. We had stained glass uteruses, and we baked 500 boob-shaped cupcakes in different skin tones and different nipple shapes, which were incredibly delicious. So it's really hard to describe the energy. It was a kind of buzzing and loving energy at the event. I've talked about it as a temporary utopia for women, for parents, babies, and families of all kinds. Like, if the world were designed for breastfeeding and pumping parents, this is exactly what it would look like. I'll show you a short video clip to try to give you a sense.
Everybody who wanted to had a 60-second opportunity to kind of tell the audience their wonderful idea and invite other people to work with them.
I'm a new mother to a 4-month-old.
My name is Camille, and I'm her best friend and not a mom.
My name is Rachel Lorenzo. I'm one of the community innovation teams, and we have our prototypes made.
And I pumped religiously for 3 months for my quintuplets, carried them full term. So when that nurse told me she threw away the milk, ain't nobody got time for that.
I'm excited about what will result and also the partnerships that are formed here and also the friendships and the networking. And hopefully that will continue after this event is over.
So that's what we did for the situation of the baby and the breast pump and the building. But after the Make the Breast Pump Not Suck hackathon, I was still curious about these questions of how to reimagine the default settings in the first place. How can we stop producing exclusionary designs, discriminatory systems, and ignorant algorithms? How can we make a more generalized approach to building buildings, breast pumps, digital systems, and public spaces that work for more than that super narrow default body, for all the bodies, in fact, in all their situations, with a little bit of joy and fun and laughter in the process. So I decided to write a book, and that book is called Data Feminism. I co-wrote it with friend and colleague Lauren Klein. In Data Feminism, we present a set of 7 principles for doing more just and equitable data science. These are informed by intersectional feminism. It's geared particularly towards explaining, at a 101 level, how we inherit these discriminatory digital systems and databases that are designed for this default body, and what actions we can take to create more liberatory systems. One of my learnings along the way is that feminism is an absolutely essential tool in our toolbox if we want to build liberatory systems. But I like being precise about exactly which feminism we are talking about, because in fact there are many feminisms and they don't all agree with each other. Feminism at its core entails a belief in equality for all genders. But if you take a look around you, you realize that this goal of equality has not yet been realized in the world. If it had, then we wouldn't get these buildings that stuff breastfeeding moms into bathroom closets. And so that brings me to the second definition of feminism, which is that it also necessarily involves organized activity and action on behalf of women and non-binary people to make this goal of equality the reality. And then feminism has a third definition, which is that it's a set of theories and ideas. These theories began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender, but the past 40 years of scholarship and also our current political reality have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the equation, including race, class, sexuality, ability, immigration status, and more. So that brings us to the idea of intersectional feminism. This idea comes to us from the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in the United States in particular. It's the idea that it's not possible to isolate certain forces of oppression from others. While we might be interested, for example, in the effects of sexism, we have to recognize that other forces interlock and intersect with each other in ways that are impossible to separate. So we cannot only look at sexism in isolation. We have to look at it in conjunction with other forces of oppression, such as white supremacy, classism, colonialism, and so on. So this leads us to this insight, which is that intersectional feminism is not only about women, nor even only about gender. It is about power, about who has it and who doesn't. So what Lauren and I do in Data Feminism is we use the teachings of intersectional feminism, along with other ideas from feminist activism and critical thought, in order to arrive at these 7 principles for doing more ethical and equitable data science. The principles are to examine power, to challenge power, to rethink binaries and hierarchies, to elevate emotion and embodiment, to embrace pluralism, to consider context, and to make labor visible. And in the book, we have one chapter devoted to each principle. In each chapter, we talk about the feminist theory that underlies that particular principle and illustrate how it can be applied to data science through a various number of examples. So our goal with these principles was to operationalize feminism for data science, to provide a clear set of principles for people currently working with data, for people who want to work with data, or even for people who want to refuse to work with data. So here I'll give a couple of examples of these principles in action. So for example, we talk about projects like Mimi Onuoha's Library of Missing Data Sets. This is an example of the principle of examining power. Missing data sets is a term coined by Onuoha, and it describes data sets that a reasonable person would expect that they would exist, but because of various reasons, they do not actually exist in real life. So these are data sets like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, people excluded from public housing for their criminal records, or even in the context of housing in the United States, you can think about the fact that we do not have comprehensive national figures about the number and location of evictions. Because there is not unified political will to collect these data, they are missing. Onuoha exhibits this library of missing data sets as both a GitHub repository, which is what you see here on the right, but also as an art installation, and that's the file cabinet that you see on the left. The files are labeled with the titles of each of the missing data sets, but when you go into the gallery and take out a folder and open it up, they are empty. And the reason that they're empty is because of this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world. This imbalance of power is what determines which data are collected, which data are not collected, which research is conducted, and which research is not. Governments have this power, corporations have this power, minoritized groups generally do not. So often when people talk about bias in data, they are talking about skews in an existing data set. But what about those data sets that simply do not exist because they are never collected? So this is why a feminist approach to data science begins with an analysis of power. So for a second example, Feminicide is another very profound case of missing data sets. In the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero. She's a Mexican citizen, an activist. She resolved to head straight towards this problem of missing data and collect the data herself. Now, for those of you who may not know, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls, and they include cisgender and transgender women. They are legally defined as crimes in the majority of Latin American countries, including in Mexico, but the state does not systematically collect and publish data on feminicide. So Maria Salguero was frustrated by the lack of formal action and the lack of implementation on laws that are actually on the books in her country. So she has now single-handedly compiled the largest public archive of feminicide in Mexico. She spends 2 to 4 hours a day logging feminicides on the Google map that you see here. She culls those from media reports. She has helped families locate loved ones, provided data to journalists and NGOs, and she's testified in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times. So this is a form of what might be called feminist counter data. This is a kind of activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the most basic human rights of their population. And it represents one way, among many, but one way to use data to challenge power. And in fact, grassroots and feminist data activism around feminicide is such a widespread practice throughout the Americas that I've written a book about it. It's called Counting Feminicide, Data Feminism in Action, and it came out from MIT Press this spring. So how can we work towards a world in which digital systems are designed to rebalance unequal power rather than exacerbate structural inequality? One of data feminism's most important principles is to embrace pluralism. So this means listening and learning from a range of perspectives and a range of ways of knowing the world, including and valuing lived experience. So we've recently started to see some of these practices of participatory design start to show up in data science, in data-driven research, and even in technology design. And in fact, one of my own recent projects has tried to mobilize this principle in the development of artificial intelligence and machine learning systems. Since 2019, I've co-led the project Data Against Feminicide with Isadora Cruchen, Silvana Fumega, and Elena Suarez-Val. So while Maria Salguero's counter data work has received a ton of media attention, there are in fact many human rights defenders who produce data about feminicide around the world. Our collaborative research team has cataloged more than 180 of these data activism projects who do this work. So our project, Data Against Feminicide, has 3 pillars that you see here. But the one that I'm focusing on here is the fact that we engaged in a participatory design process with activists to build AI and digital tools. We sought to prioritize listening to the data activists themselves and learning from them about what digital tools they need to detect and monitor feminicide in their contexts. And what we ended up with is a tool that supports and sustains activist labor. So here, I just want to underline the different stages of participation and design. Building an AI system, or even any digital tool in the first place, was not a foregone conclusion. First, we worked in brainstorming workshops to discuss whether and how digital tools could help to streamline activist work and/or reduce the emotional toll that this work takes on them. It's been an iterative process for over 4 years, and we have now built 2 tools that are being used by more than 50 human rights monitoring groups around the world. Notably, we engaged groups in participatory sessions at very early stages, as well as for data annotation to train machine learning models, as well as for tool evaluation. So the tool you see on the right here is an email alerts platform. It's very similar to Google Alerts, if you're familiar with that technology, but is specifically tuned for surfacing feminicide cases to activists. And this is what I meant when I'm talking about a tool that supports and sustains activist labor. We've ended up with a tool that reduces some of the emotional burden of doing the work of systematically documenting violence, but it's not a tool that seeks to automate or to outsource or to replace activist expertise with AI. So the next example from data feminism that I want to discuss relates to the principle of rethinking binaries and hierarchies. Feminist theory has talked a lot about the gender binary. So this is the false idea that there are only 2 genders, men and women. So what's wrong with this idea? First of all, the gender binary is empirically wrong. We know that there are and there have been more than 2 genders across all human cultures since time immemorial. But second, the gender binary is actually hiding something. It's hiding a hierarchy where men are on the top and women are on the bottom. And so feminist theorists say, if this binary, the gender binary, is empirically wrong, and is also based on a harmful form of domination, then which other binaries are also wrong and also harmful? So one of the other binaries that we often encounter is the false distinction between reason on the one hand and emotion on the other. In an Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data science and in data visualization in particular. So the best practices for data visualization often involve a clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, and a just the facts kind of approach. But in data feminism, we say why. Why are these our best practices? Particularly when research has shown that illustration, embellishment, emotion, and visual novelty make for more recognizable and more memorable and more accessible data visualizations. So what about the opposite? Visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion. That's what this next example helps us to explore. So what you're looking at here of an animated visualization, it represents the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in 2018. Each of the people killed by a gun in that year is represented as a single arc. The arcs are traced one by one on the screen, starting out slow, but then they get faster and faster until they create that semicircular web that you see in the larger image. It's overwhelming to watch. It's almost unbearable. And that's the point. It goes on for too long because there are too many people being killed by guns in the US. Too many deaths are plotted on the same visualization because too many people are being killed. It's an epidemic. Methodologically, this visualization is no less statistically sound than any other study. The data about the people derived from a national crime data set, and their projected lifespans are determined using a sophisticated statistical model, which relies on lifespan estimates from the World Health Organization. But when it came out, it was viewed with suspicion by the visualization community because it made us feel first and foremost. But a feminist approach here would say that this is not a problem at all, that it made us feel things. In fact, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason with emotion. Rebalancing emotion and reason opens up the data communication toolbox and allows us to focus on what truly matters in a design process, honoring context, listening to experience, and taking action to challenge the imbalances of power that we encounter in the world. So those are just a few of the examples that illustrate how we can use data feminism's 7 principles to create data science, systems, and products that challenge the default body and the default settings of the world. I want to end with this quote from Arundhati Roy. She says, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." I find hope in Roy's words because she tells us that the futures that we dream of are not so far away. We are not that far away from digital systems that challenge the patriarchy or buildings that embrace breastfeeding parents. In fact, we can, and we did, transform that building and bend it to meet the needs of more than the default body. We have everything that we need right here and right now to challenge the default settings and to create those futures where all bodies can flourish. So thank you very, very much. Here are 500 different ways to be in touch with me, and I look forward to your feedback, your comments, and your questions. Thanks.